When I was 10 years old, my younger brother, was 8. I remember it being around that time because he was really still too small to help us that much. Each fall, as it got cooler weather, my dad would take us to the woods on a part of the farm that we lived on in west central Alabama, and we would cut down firewood for the winter. In reality, we cut it down a year before to a great extent, and we're just supplementing it and putting another in store for the fact we were going to use some of the old wood. So we were cutting down the wood and cutting it up, and I was doing my part in loading it onto the truck, and my brother was with our dog, one of our dogs, and the dog jumped a rabbit. Now, I don't know if you know what jumping a rabbit means. The rabbit jumped and the dog took off after him. And Dad yelled at my brother, says, "Follow him, see where he goes." My brother, who was 8, took him literally. He followed that dog multiple miles through the woods, and we lost track of him. We went home, Dad and me, with the wood, assuming that my younger brother had just gone on home after he gave up the chase. Indeed, he was not there. As you can imagine, my mother was upset. First of all, my dad, and then secondly, she was upset that we couldn't find him. She called around. We got in the truck and drove around looking for him. Couldn't find him. He was somewhere lost in the woods. My mother was in tears. My dad was worried about the dog. And my brother. So I still remember this day. She was in tears and all. She was picked up the phone calling everybody. Back then we were on a party line. You could interrupt a conversation to get the word out. Anybody remember a party line? Some of you young folks don't. I can't. I could just barely remember a party line. But we couldn't find him, and it was getting dark. And we were standing out there in the yard, and she was upset, and I was a little worried myself, even though he was a younger brother. I was still a little worried. And all of a sudden we saw him in the distance, walking up with the dog. He'd walked for miles. Never caught the rabbit. But when he got home, or when he started to approach, my mother ran out to him, and she was crying and upset. She hugged him and all, brought him in the house, telling him how scared she was that something terrible had happened to him. Just loved on him and let him sat beside him on the couch. And I remember thinking, I need to get lost more often myself. You see, just like our story today, there was a lost son, the one we know that wandered away, got himself into trouble. But in reality, we're going to see there were 2 lost sons in the story. Because you can be lost and never leave home. Let's talk about the story. It's perhaps the most beloved parable that Jesus told. Because it conveys such a warm spirit of loving acceptance and welcome. Jesus wanted us to see God that way, because Jesus himself was that way. It really comes in the context of the Pharisees' critique of Jesus because he violated their sense of religious propriety. You see, it says there at the beginning of the chapter that tax collectors and sinners, for the Pharisees, those were the notorious sinners. It says they were coming to Jesus. They enjoyed being around them because he welcomed them. Because he had said earlier in this same gospel that the healthy don't need a doctor. It's the sick. And he wanted to, as he said in another place, seek and to save those who are lost, as told in the story of Zacchaeus. Save in the Gospel of Luke is really a word that, well, you may be surprised, it means to bring or to restore health to a person. Jesus connected with people that he knew were living in unhealthy situations so that he could restore them to spiritual health. That's what he was there for. But the Pharisees, and the word Pharisee is sometimes translated the separated ones, felt it was very important to stay apart from such people. And they knew down deep in their hearts that Jesus couldn't be really a representative of God because he welcomed the kind of people that they'd never wanted to be seen with. So Jesus told some stories. He really tells 3 parables, all to emphasize the same point. He tells a story about a lost sheep where the shepherd has 99, but one wanders away. And at that moment in time, the most important one is not the ones he still had, but the one that was missing. So he finds that sheep, and he rejoices. He calls his friends, and they have a party because he found his lost sheep. Then a lost silver coin. A woman loses one of 10 silver coins. Now, the 9 that she still had, again, it wasn't the most important thing at the moment. It was finding that one lost silver coin most of all. Again, when she found it, she calls her friends and they rejoice because she's found that one lost coin. And then the final story, that's only found in Luke's gospel. The other 2 in some versions are found in the other gospels, but this one in Luke's gospel, the only place in the Bible where this story is found. It's become known as the story of the prodigal son. Now, I grew up in church, and for years I didn't know what a prodigal was. I assumed it couldn't be good. What does prodigal mean? It means someone who's wasteful, who throws away his life and his resources. It's prodigal. Well, you're familiar with the story, right? There are really 3 characteristics. And by the way, most of the time with a parable, there's one central point, and that is true. There is one central point to this parable as well, but it's crafted so beautifully that you can really see multiple characterizations in the story. I want to take just a moment to remind you of those characterizations. You're familiar with them, but let's see them again for the first time. First of all, in the parable of the prodigal, the son represents those who are lost to God's good purposes because they've wandered away and wasted the good gifts God has given them. This is a story of a restless son, a younger son. There's 2, an older and a younger. And he asks for his inheritance early so he can strike out on his own. He's tired of these cramped quarters with dad and the family. He's ready to go. So he asks for the inheritance early, which is very insulting then as well as now, because basically when you're asking for your inheritance early so you can split, what does that usually mean? As far as he was concerned, his father couldn't die fast enough. Really? That's the message hidden here. And in the ancient world, when they heard Jesus tell this story, they would have all the more gotten that point. He was essentially saying, you're as good as dead to me. Give me my money early and I'll go. So the father, and without question, divides the resources. The younger son would have typically gotten a little lesser portion anyway than the older son. That's neither here nor there. He divides the resources, gives the younger son the inheritance, and then does something else. He lets him walk away. He gives him his freedom. Don't miss that point. He lets him wander away and then waste all of his inheritance. He blows all of his inheritance, as the older brother says, on prostitutes. So he went to the far country, far away from home, and he blows all his money on wild living. It says in the old King James Version, riotous living. I love that, riotous living. He was having a party. He was having a good time until a famine hit the land and his money ran out. And then this young Jewish boy found himself in a place that no young Jewish boy would have found him in. And that's how the hearers are supposed to hear the story. This young Jewish boy had to resort to feeding the hogs, feeding the pigs. I grew up on a farm. We had pigs. I fed the pigs many times. It's not a glamorous activity. Sometimes you have to wade out into the muck and the mire and get to the pig trough, and it's a messy job. It's not fun for a Gentile like me. For a Jewish boy, this would have been horrible, because it was not only that he had to feed the pigs, he had to share in some of their cuisine. It says in the New Revised Standard Version, he ate the pods that the pigs would have eaten. For me, that would have been like eating old dried corn off the cob that we were feeding to our pigs. All right, that's just a bad way to live. And he's there in this very difficult situation, having wandered away from home, having insulted his father, blown all his money, and now he's in one of the worst situations he can be in and still be alive in a pig pen. And it says in one of those wonderful phrases, he came to himself. Have you ever come to yourself? Have you had one of those moments where you realize, man, I got myself in a mess? And it dawns on you, this is no way to live. So he gets an idea. And he's humbled. He's humiliated by the whole experience. He realizes at this point he's made some bad decisions. So he says, I got an idea. I know that my father, who's apparently fairly wealthy, has presumably a large farm in the state. He has some hired hands, and I'll go back and I'll just, I'll humbly drag myself back to the father, and I'll ask him, just make me one of your servants so that I can, live in a better situation than I am. So he gets up and he returns home. And what does the story say? It says, when the father sees him in the distance, the father runs to him. You can imagine the scene, throws his arms around him, tells the hired servants, go get a robe, and notice the language, the best robe. The best robe. And go get a ring for his finger. And then kill the fatted calf, the special calf we reserve for parties, for big to-dos. Kill it, we're going to have a celebration. This is the second characterization. The first represents that tendency we all have as human beings to think we know better than God or the people who love us in our lives, and we wander away. And more often than not, we find out that was a bad plan, and we find that it leads us to a dark place. There is within human nature this capacity to allow our own self-interest that we think of as our self-interest to devolve into self-absorption, where we lose regard for God and others, and we just strike out on our own thinking we can do this better all by ourselves. And often we find ourselves in a terrible situation. But we can go home, because the second characterization is that of the father, who when he sees him in the distance, imagine this for a moment, the father had let the son walk away. He let him go. He'd given him what he wanted. He just, okay, you can go. But notice the language. You get the impression that every day while the father carried on his business, he always had one eye toward the horizon, looking for the son to return. And when he sees him, he doesn't go and bring up all the stuff that's passed between them. He doesn't go and hand him the bill for the inheritance he's taken early. At that moment, the father, who represents God in this story, this parable, at that moment, the most important thing in the world to the father was the fact that the son had come home. And this is a story of recovery and redemption. And it's the message of Jesus through and through. It's a message that, yes, you may wander away, but our God is a God who always looks to the horizon, hoping that you will return. And when you do, He's more delighted that you came home than he was disappointed that you left to begin with. But there's one more character in this story. You see, one son wandered away from home and wasted all of his inheritance, and then came back and found redemption and recovery and a huge party, okay? But there's another son, the good son, the elder son. He doesn't leave home. He doesn't ask for his inheritance early. Notice where he is. He's out in the fields working, okay? I'll tell you what, I read this story, and I had a lot of sympathy for the elder son because I had a younger brother. I have a lot of sympathy for him, all right, because he did the right things, okay? Fair enough? I mean, in reality, and I can hear him thinking, if I'd have done the same thing, and he did say this to the father, because he goes, when the father tries to get him to join the party, what does he say? He insults the father. I've been here all along, working and doing just what you told me to do, and what do I get for it? You didn't even give me a goat. Notice that, not a fatted calf. You didn't give me even a goat to celebrate with my friends, and I did the right thing. You hear that? I'm a little sympathetic. Why does Jesus tell the story this way? Who does the elder son represent in the story? Pharisees. Exactly. The Pharisees. You see, the son resented the fact that the elder son resented the fact that the younger son came back. As far as he was concerned, he was dead to him and he could stay dead. He was lost, good riddance. He deserved it. He was thinking in terms of justice, not mercy. And I know you balance those two in human relationships, and they're very important. But Jesus here tells us something about himself, and he tells us something about the Father, and that is to err on the side of compassion. For the Father said to the Son, look, son, you've been with me this whole time, and everything that I have is yours. The younger son is saying, yeah, well, except for his half of the inheritance, and the best robe, and a gold ring, and a fatted calf, yeah, okay. Everything else. Because indeed, at this point, the elder son, would have inherited the remainder, okay? We're never told that the father then added more inheritance to the younger son who'd blown it. So the older son is thinking through this thing from the standpoint of what is exacting justice. But Jesus is saying about this elder son, and really indirectly directly to the Pharisees, you know, you're deeply concerned with righteousness and justice and doing the right things, but you've lost your ability to feel compassion for people who've wandered away and lost their way. And so now your son who was dead is now alive. He was lost, but now he's been found. Can't you have a little compassion? After all, and you should hear this in the story and be careful not to miss it, it was the father who took the losses. The person who should have been offended most of all cared for the relationship more than he did the riches. So he showed him mercy and love and compassion. But the elder son, like the Pharisee in the story, and the Pharisees, by the way, in Jesus' day were admired for their strictness, their separation from the other. But in this story, Jesus turns it inside out and upside down, as he does throughout his ministry, and says, God is really like the loving Father. He wants to show mercy. And Jesus, by extension, is saying, I'm the same way. So when you see these people around me, these tax collectors, these sinners, the kind of people that the younger son would have hung out with in the far country, if you see these people around me and you wonder what I'm doing, he says, I'm trying to help them. Because for me, they're like the lost sheep. They're like the lost silver coin. They're like the lost son. At this moment in time, if you want to have a real party in heaven, see one of these people repent, as we talked about last week, reorient their lives according to the principles of love for God and love for neighbor as themselves. When that happens, Jesus says there's a party in heaven, and there ought to be a party that you want to be a part of, but you're so concerned about keeping yourself pure, you're willing to destroy another person's life. If you notice Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus was willing to risk a bad reputation to reach out and connect with people and hopefully connect them with God and reconnect them with the significant people in their lives. He was called a glutton. He was called a drunkard. And worst of all for the Pharisees, he was called a friend of sinners. All those three things Jesus was called. He had a bad reputation among the religious establishment of his day. We miss that if we're not careful because we've institutionalized Jesus. We've made him the establishment. But in reality, if we're not careful, those of us who've grown up in the church, maybe we've never left home. If we're not careful, we'll find ourselves, just like the elder brother, lost at home. Because you can be very involved in religious things, but still far away from the heart of God. Is that not true? Jesus says the heart of God is a heart of compassion. As I think about that for myself and for our church, certainly we'll always try to balance the principles of justice and compassion. We don't want to live in a world of all of one or the other. There's a balance, a rhythm there, if you will. But what we should do, as Jesus taught us, is always make sure that we err on the side of mercy and compassion so that people can be restored to God's good purpose for their lives.